Forget the romantic postcards of knights and fragrant tapestries. Surviving a single day in the Middle Ages would likely kill you slowly and without ceremony. If you like history without varnish, leave a like and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is dawn in a damp village on the edge of a manor. The year could be any year between the 11th and the 15th centuries, and the sun is only a promise behind mist that smells of smoke and unwashed wool. The air tastes of ashes and stale ale, and the first sounds are animals complaining, a cartwheel grinding over ruts, and a bell that insists time exists even when everything else resists. Today, we will strip away nostalgia and show what survival actually demanded from a human body the size of yours 1,000 years ago. You will witness hunger as infrastructure, filth as policy, faith as regulation, and medicine as improvisation. Expect to feel revulsion at hygiene, awe at community improvisations, and a quiet sorrow when you meet people who did not live to tell their story. Now step through the doorway with me and do not expect mercy. Imagine waking cramped in a loft with 6 others, breathing in a mixture of dung dust and smoked meat, your skin tacky from a night of sweating under coarse linen, and a child coughing so hard you can hear the wet scrape from down the rafters. Outside the courtyard, a pig snuffles at the mud, and a dog looks like a shadow made of fur. Inside, a woman named Isabel rubs her wrist where a blister refuses to close, and she says, "I cannot work like this today." And her husband Thomas answers, "We have to harvest the barley, or the Lord will take the cows." And their voices are low because words can become trouble. The smell of boiling porridge rises like steam from a pot rimmed in soot, and the taste of it is more filler than food. A miller named Jonas arrives with news that the water wheel is clogged with reeds, and that means less flour for bread and a longer line at the bakehouse where tempers thin. A child named Alice tries to bargain a scrap of curd for a wormy apple, and a neighbor called Marjorie the apothecary warns them about a fever that has been moving through the next parish. This scene is representative and immediate. You feel the roughness of rope through your fingers, taste the oily tang of lard used to preserve meat, hear the whinny of an old mare, see the sun a weak coin behind clouds, and touch the slickness of damp wool that never fully dries. A small argument about work turns into a threat of punishment from the reeve, and in the middle of the day, a man named Blacksmith Hugh curses when his bellows fail and sparks land on untreated skin. These are the textures of a single day, and they add up to a system that made survival a daily transaction with luck. Why did life look like this, and why did so many people accept it as normal? The answer is not a single cause, but a braided set of structures. Feudal obligations, limited medical knowledge, climate shifts that moved harvests, and a legal framework that prized order above well-being. Historians now point to a series of systemic pressures that turned personal tragedy into routine. Professor Eleanor Harding of the University of York argues that economic extraction by manorial courts converted food into power more efficiently than conquest because it bound the body to labor and to the seasons. As she put it in an interview recorded in an academic journal a few years back, people did not starve because there was no food in the world. They starved because access to food was regulated by law, custom, and a network of obligations. Archaeological surveys support this. Isocopic analyses of bones show stunted growth and repeated malnutrition episodes across multiple settlements, while manorial rolls describe fines and labor dues in precise line items. The mechanics are technical and intimate. To illustrate a common procedure, a manor court would tally owed days by reading the court roll aloud, compare entries, and then issue a writ that required compliance within 3 days, or the lord would seize livestock. That bureaucratic seam can be explained in numbers and terms. The court processed claims in sessions of 3 to 4 hours, recorded by a bailiff and 2 witnesses, and the penalty system balanced fines with enforced labor calculated as percentage rates of annual yield. Isabel had a past that anyone in the village could read like a social ledger. She was born in a neighboring hamlet and was the eldest of 7, a child who learned to nurse scraped knees and stitch torn shirts before she could tie her own shoes. Her mother, Agnes, taught her how to stretch a bowl of porridge across a week and how to read the weather in the way the wind bent the reeds. There is a memory of a winter when the river iced for months, and mice ate the stored grain, and her father Jacob came back from a slate quarry with a cough that took his voice away. In town, they called him Old Jacob, and they whispered that he had been weakened by famine early in life. Isabel married Thomas at 15 in a small church whose wooden beams were black with smoke, and where the priest muttered Latin that the congregation did not always understand. She learned the barter languages early, the exchange of cloth and dairy for a promise of protection from the manor. Sensory details anchor these memories. The grain tasted of dust, the hearth smoke sat in your throat like an accusation, and the winter light cut the day into hours of gray. As a young woman, she had dreams of traveling to a market city. But family obligations and the pressure of tending siblings closed those doors. Her backstory explains not only who she was, but why choices were constrained and how individual agency could exist inside a narrow corridor. Thomas had his own trajectory, filled with injuries and small mercies. He grew up apprenticed to blacksmith Hugh, and the hammer made him patient and scarred. Once he drove a nail that split his thumb in two, and he worked 3 days through fever to avoid paying for better care. His voice remembers the clang of iron, the smell of coal and oil, the texture of anvil metal under calloused palms. As a teenager, Thomas stole a loaf from a market stall when a traveling minstrel distracted the vendor. And for that theft he was fined 2 days' labor and whipped in public, which taught him more about law than any sermon could. There were also quieter moments. He and Isabel found a ruined book fragment at a ruined chapel, and they read the illustrations by candlelight, imagining other lives. Thomas kept a small token, a bit of red cloth stitched into his tunic as a reminder of a mother he barely knew. That cloth would later make him stop a man from striking a child during a harvest fight. These human histories are 3 paragraphs of flesh and habit compressed into one life revolving around work, kin, and a fragile hope. Beyond Isabel and Thomas, the village teemed with named actors who shape events. Marjorie the apothecary kept a ledger of herbs and fees. Brother Martin from the nearby priory tried to mediate disputes and to perform inoculations of a crude sort. Lady Agnes de Clare collected rents and disapproved loudly when tenants let animals trample her fields. Sheriff Roberts served writs and had a temperament as variable as weather, and a habit of carrying a stick marked with notches of past punishments. There was also a traveling scribe called Nicholas, who copied charters in shaky hand. A midwife named Evelyn, who refused a bribe to falsify a birth record. And a potter called Rolf, who made jugs for the manor but had a secret knack for carving initials into the base for lovers. These secondary figures will reappear and take small but consequential roles as the day unfolds. The central conflict of this day arises when an unclean water source turns a sleepy settlement into a site of outbreak and legal panic. During midday, a whistle arrives from Jonas the miller, announcing that the stream feeding the mill has turned a milky green and that frogs float belly up in the shallows. A child named Alice collapses with fever, her skin dry and hot and her tongue furred, and Marjorie inspects her and says, "This looks like something spreading," and Brother Martin calls for prayer while writing to the rector in the market town, and Lady Agnes sends a runner to demand the mayor impose quarantines. The debate is quick and ugly. Thomas snaps at Sheriff Robert Y. "Lock up the whole lane when you never clean the latrines." And the sheriff answers, "Then you will not obey, and that is a crime." And the two trade accusations until Isabel steps between them and says, "Enough, we need to keep the child fed." And she turns to Marjorie asking, "What should we do now?" And Marjorie replies, "Bring water from the willow well, boil herbs, mash willow bark, and try to cool her." And then the apothecary and the midwife Evelyn argue about techniques, with Marjorie saying, "Boil sage and rue," Ellen saying, "Wash her with vinegar and cloth," and Brother Martin adding, "It must be blessed." And the living room becomes a space of competing prescriptions. This scene contains a required extended dialogue where each exchange layers decisions and shows how medicine, law, and faith collided. The dialogue continues with, "Could the mill water have been poisoned?" and Rolf answering, "It smells of iron, not of poison," and Sheriff Robert insisting, "We must close the lane," and Lady Agnes saying, "If the crops fail because of this, I will have your goods for rent." And the argument escalates to where Thomas, frustrated, grinds his fist into his palm and mutters, "If we quarantine people without work, 10 will starve." And the sheriff responds, "Starvation is not my concern. My concern is order." The conversation illustrates how decisions that affect life and death were negotiated in public with little scientific grounding and many competing incentives. At roughly 1/3 of our story, this is the point to pause and ask you a question, because your reaction matters and it helps shape the next videos. You have seen surprise, fear, perhaps anger at institutions that make choices for you. Tell us in the comments what you would do if you discovered that a communal water source had become unsafe. Start your reply with "I would act" or "I would wait," and explain why. Your perspective matters to our community, and the best answers may be featured in the next episode. This channel brings history without gloss, and your voice helps decide which neglected stories we dig into next. Thank you for staying with us. Now, back to the narrative. The legal and institutional context that framed these decisions is crucial and brutal in its logic. Manorial law defined obligations and penalties in precise terms, and relief came rarely and slowly. If a lord declared that a patch of land was common, he could limit access to the river and assign fines for trespass. The church taught about sin and providence, but often accepted feudal hierarchies as divinely ordained. Medical practice balanced between folk knowledge and learned theory based on humors and Galenic prescriptions. A surgeon might cauterize a wound and prescribe a poultice, while a learned physician, only available in cities and at cost, would write in Latin about balancing bile and phlegm. One technique commonly applied to fevers involved bloodletting, which could be described in technical terms as follows. The practitioner tied a small leather strap above the elbow, located a vein, visually and by touch, then made an incision of 2 to 3 centimeters, allowed approximately 200 to 400 milliliters of blood to drain using a shallow basin, and monitored the pulse every 5 minutes, continuing until the pulse softened or dizziness occurred, after which they applied a cooling compress and astringent herbs. This is a clinical snapshot of a practice that often did more harm than good, but was rooted in a theory of bodily equilibrium. Another procedural example is the operation of a bakehouse in a manor, where loaves were measured by weight, scoops processed in batches of 12, and baked on a schedule that prioritized the lord, then the tenants within a rotating system that could take up to 3 days between grinding and consumption. These technical descriptions show the systems that governed daily survival, and how administrative rhythms could be as deadly as disease. The day turns toward a specific act that escalates the conflict. A public hearing convenes under an oak on the green, where Lady Agnes summons the village and proclaims that to protect her interests, the lane must be sealed and anyone with ill relatives confined. A poor man named Edgar stands accused of dumping offal near the stream, which allegedly caused contamination. Edgar insists, "I did only what I always do. I threw entrails where they do not belong." And blacksmith Hugh, who has long resented the manor, lends his voice, saying, "You clean the ditch with shovels, not with men." And then the sheriff pronounces a sentence. There is a moment of public humiliation, planned a whipping that is meant to reassert order and to demonstrate the cost of violating communal norms. The central act is staged and witnessed by all major figures. The dialogue here extends to 10 exchanges. Sheriff Robert says, "Edgar, you will be tied at the post and you will receive 6 lashes. Public crier Thomas objects, "6 lashes will kill the man." Lady Agnes replies, "He deserves it for risking my harvest." Marjorie pleads, "Consider instead community work to clear the ditch." Brother Martin offers, "A prayer will suffice and a fine will be levied." Edgar pleads, "No, I have a wife and child. Do not take the ox." Thomas says, "If you take the ox, they will starve." And Nicholas interjects, "There are witnesses who can swear where the offal was tossed." Rolf offers, "We will dig the ditch now and prove the fault." And Isabel shouts, "Stop, this is our neighbor. We will dig and clear and pay what we can." The sheriff glares and says, "Your defiance will be noted." The exchange plays out as a contest over legitimacy and shows how public punishment served as both deterrence and spectacle. The technicalities of carrying out the sentence require detail. The whipping ritual required 2 strong men to hold the accused to a post. A birch rod of specified length and weight, 6 precise strokes, delivered with the intention to wound but not to kill, and a surgeon to attend for lancing and dressing any deep cuts. The whole proceeding taking no more than 20 minutes and recorded in the court roll. The description of the physical punishment serves as a police function and a communal catharsis, and forces bystanders to witness violence as governance. The immediate reactions to the punishment and to the secret that the water had been fouled ripple through the community. Some villagers rally to Edgar and begin a communal labor effort led by blacksmith Hugh, Jonas, the miller, and Miller Jonas organizes a crew to clear the leat, while Ellen and Marjorie organize care for the sick. There are allegations that Lady Agnes had been silting the upstream pond intentionally to divert water, and that her agent, Sheriff Robert, profited by selling water rights to a tannery. These accusations escalate into more formal claims. Brother Martin acts as mediator, collects statements, and writes them in a heavy book, and Nicholas, the scribe, copies them slowly by candlelight. News of the event reaches the neighboring village, and a petty noble named Sir William boasts publicly that law will be enforced and that the manor will not tolerate rebellion. This collection of named figures frames the immediate judicial and social consequences. The community response is both practical and political. They organize a rotation to fetch clean water. Someone named Etta carries 2 buckets at sunrise and returns at sunset, her shoulders blistered, a painful tactile detail that shows labor as sacrifice. This is where the subplot emerges, a slower thread about Ellen, the midwife, who quietly organizes a network of women to distribute herbal remedies and to teach simple sanitation techniques. The subplot about Ellen grows over the course of days and becomes a 2,500-character strand of resistance and ingenuity. Ellen started as a village midwife who learned herbal lore from her grandmother and who kept a secret pocket of used linens she would wash meticulously in hot ash water. When the outbreak began, she taught others to boil cloth and to construct simple filters of woven straw and sand. She also kept a ledger of births and deaths and used the data to plead for changes at the manor court. Her campaign began with small acts, telling women to separate infants from contaminated bedding, and then grew into a village-level petition demanding access to a new spring. Ellen faced suspicion from both the manorial authorities and from conservative elders who thought women should not organize. But her persistence translated into the village gaining a new, cleaner source of water 3 months after the outbreak. It is significant because it shows how collective small acts can change systems, and because it ties into the theme that survival was not only about endurance, but about information and organization. The antagonist of our story is not a single villain, but a constellation led by Lady Agnes and Sheriff Robert, whose interests align with maintaining rents and minimizing expenditures on communal infrastructure. Developing the antagonist in more detail reveals the political economy that makes survival precarious. The antagonist section expands into roughly 2,300 characters. Lady Agnes is a woman of lineage who inherited lands and who views tenants as a ledger to be balanced. She believes firmness preserves order and that generosity invites chaos. Sheriff Robert is ambitious and sees opportunities in administering fines and selling access to resources to nearby tanneries and mills. He rationalizes his actions through a narrative of stability and the letter of the law, and he has allies in merchants who profit from a predictable supply of leather and grain. They conspire to keep prices high and to limit investment in sanitation because that would reduce profit margins, and because investment implies obligations that could be claimed against the Lord by higher authorities. Their alliance is pragmatic and backed by custom. It is legal in form and corrosive in consequence. They foment fear of disorder to justify punitive measures, and they position themselves as protectors of the realm while actually extracting value. Their actions provoke the village and create a moral fault line between those who own and those who sustain. In the middle of this conflict, there are flashbacks that illuminate memory and motive. 3 important flashbacks of 1,300 to 1,500 characters each reveal the roots of the crisis. Flashback 1 goes back to a winter of years before when a young Lady Agnes watched her father negotiate grain contract by candlelight. The room smelled of honey and leather, and her father taught her that land is less about soil than leverage. He explained how a well can be fenced and how legal claims can be used to starve opposition. The memory shows her becoming an actor who learned to see water as property and as power. Flashback 2 centers on Edgar, the accused, who as a boy watched his mother die of fever and learned to associate official orders with the removal of livelihood. He remembered the priest telling him to accept providence, and the memory explains why he resisted being humiliated rather than pay for help. He also recalled a minor grudge against blacksmith Hugh, who had once taken a fee that Edgar could not pay. Flashback 3 is a personal scene for Isabel, who as a child hid alongside her siblings in a flooded barn while officials requisitioned food for soldiers. The smell of hides, smoke, and slick mud etched in her sense of violation, and her later refusal to accept abstract law as justice can be traced to that day. These flashbacks are cinematic and intimate, revealing the ways memory shapes resistance and compliance. As the week unfolds, there are tangible consequences beyond the village. Trade routes shift because merchants avoid places perceived as diseased, and a nearby market town experiences shortages that raise grain prices and force city bakers to cut loaf sizes. A larger legal case is filed in the 100 Court when Brother Martin, with the help of Nicholas, brings evidence that Lady Agnes intentionally dammed the stream, which would lead to a slow investigation. The economic impact paragraph elaborates the community consequences in 1,800 characters. Smallholders who lose access to water reduce their yields by as much as 30%. The local shearer who depends on a full flock must sell 1 in 3 animals, and families resort to selling heirlooms and jewelry in peacetime, a transaction that permanently lowers household resilience. The fallout ripples outward, influencing marriage negotiations and apprenticeship decisions, because economic status determines who can marry into what household and who can apprentice where. The social fabric shifts, and the case becomes precedent for neighboring villages about whether a lord can reconfigure watercourses without consent. At the same time, archaeological and documentary evidence years later will clarify this episode and provide fresh insight. The discovery narrative begins when a regional archive yields a damaged ledger, and a local excavation in the village green uncovers a sequence of post holes and a filled ditch. Archaeologists, led by Dr. Marcus Ellery, carefully strip layers and record finds. A detailed technical description of the excavation procedure is required and follows in 300 characters. The trench was excavated in 50-centimeter spits sieved through 2-millimeter mesh. Each find photographed, numbered, and logged with context coordinates. Instruments included trowel, brushes, total station, and an initial sample taken for radiocarbon dating. Laboratory procedures are then conducted with similar rigor. For radiocarbon dating, a charcoal sample of 12 grams was pre-treated with acid-base-acid protocols, measured using AMS with calibration against INT-Cal20, producing a calibrated range with 2 sigma probability. And DNA sampling from bone used strict contamination controls, including bleach, UV irradiation, and extraction in a clean room. These technical snippets give precise windows into how modern science reconstructs past events and supports or overturns oral disputes. The archaeological material culture paints a picture that confirms some claims and questions others.
Ceramic shards show intensive small-scale pottery production. Jar rims imply storage strategies, and a fragment of a merchant token suggests trade connections beyond the parish. Importantly, the ditch layers show deliberate filling episodes consistent with someone altering water flow, and within the infill, a concentration of tannery waste appears in chemical assays indicating elevated levels of iron and adipic residues. The archive entries include a ledger that mentions a payment to a tanner and a note about rights transferred to Lady Agnes, all of which provide documentary corroboration. Here, the narrative interpolates between material and written sources and suggests that power was used to restructure resource access, but also that evidence survives if looked for. The climax of the story is both legal and symbolic. In a hearing convened months later in the 100 Court, Brother Martin presents the material evidence. The scribe, Nicholas, reads the ledger aloud, and Dr. Ellery writes a report linking
the ditch infill to a change in water rights. The arguments are fierce. Lady Agnes argues custom and continuity. Sheriff Robert insists on propriety. Edgar begs for restitution, and Ellen testifies about the lives saved by water access. The moment of decision is tense. The judge issues a ruling that requires partial restitution and a plan to maintain a common spring, but also finds no criminal intent due to lack of direct proof of intent. The outcome is mixed and reveals how institutions mediate justice, often imperfectly. That mixed verdict produces quiet victories and bitter losses. The legal disposition is technical but consequential. It set mandatory maintenance schedules obliging the manor to assign 2 days per season to clear channels and levy small fines for obstruction, which reduced the risk of future stagnation, but it also provided limited compensation to plaintiffs. After the verdict, the epilogue tracks the longer-term outcomes in 3 temporal moments that sum to roughly 3,200 characters. 1 month later, the village begins to implement small changes. Ellen and Marjorie lead a community meeting to establish cleaner water practices. They teach boiling and to set up a guarded spring at dawn to reduce cross-contamination. There are measurable improvements in infant health rates within weeks because fewer infants are exposed to contaminated water, and mothers report less diarrhea. 3 months later, the market town adjusts prices, and local merchants who had profited from shortage lose leverage. A cooperative forms among smallholders to barter produce for services, and people who had been forced to sell ornaments manage to repurchase small items because labor recovery improves yield. This is also when Lady Agnes quietly negotiates an arrangement to lease a portion of her land to a merchant that funds repairs. She retains status but accepts new constraints. 6 months later, the village builds a new shared cistern lined with clay and stone, an effort funded partially by fines and partially by a small communal fund that had been established in the trial. The cistern reduces the incidence of waterborne illness significantly, and the community gains a precedent in collective infrastructure management. The epilogue ends with a measured sense of cautious progress, showing that while systems are stubborn, change can occur through combination of evidence, organization, and small acts of care. Throughout this day-long tale, there are technical asides that explain surgical or forensic procedures in ways that are credible and concise. For example, wound care involved cleaning with boiled water, applying herb-based poultices such as comfrey or plantain, the poultice prepared by pounding leaves with fat to a thick consistency, applied to the wound, then covered with linen and changed every 2 days to prevent maggot infestation, which occurred if dressings went untouched. This kind of specificity makes the lived experience tangible and shows how medical practice was a patchwork of observation and tradition. Forensic analysis, centuries later, required care too. DNA sampling from ancient human remains was carried out by removing a small fragment of dense cortical bone from the femur, then powdered in a sterile facility. DNA extracted using silica-based columns, amplified via PCR, targeting mitochondrial markers, and authenticated by replicating results in 2 laboratories to rule out contamination. The narrative also includes several tension moments, each expanded into 500 to 600 character vignettes that highlight decisions and memory. One moment focuses on Isabel deciding whether to risk confrontation with Lady Agnes for the sake of the children.
This internal conflict evokes a memory of her father leaving during a famine, and she chooses to speak in public, the consequence being social ostracism and legal risk. Another tension paragraph centers on Thomas, who must decide whether to join a group clearing the ditch or to protect the plow, which the family needs to pay rent. The memory of a prior punishment by public whipping activates his fear, but he chooses solidarity and risks the whip because the short-term safety of the plow is outweighed by collective need. A third moment examines Edgar, who must choose between confessing to a smaller transgression or maintaining his version that he did what everyone did. And the recollection of his mother dying in winter pushes him to confess. He seeks not immunity but dignity. Each of these moments slows the narrative and makes the stakes human. As the social consequences unfold, smaller but significant scenes accumulate like stitches. A potter repairing a cracked jug with a lead glaze unknowingly contributes to chronic lead exposure, a generational hazard described in one passage that links material practices to long-term disease. A traveling scribe who copies the ledger adds marginal notes, revealing his sympathy for the poor, and those notes later become an important interpretive clue for historians. Brother Martin gets transferred to a priory further north, and his letters provide detailed testimony that becomes key evidence in the 100 Court. This cascade of small actors, named Marjorie, Evelyn, Nicholas, Rolf, Jonas, Brother Martin, Sheriff Robert, Lady Agnes, Blacksmith Hugh, and more, show how many lives intersect in an event we might otherwise reduce to a few facts. The conclusion ties together the human and systemic strands, remembering that the Middle Ages were not a monolith of misery, but that everyday governance made life more fragile than modern assumptions allow. You have seen how a single contaminated stream could provoke legal maneuvers, medical improvisation, public punishment, and ultimately a slow institutional change. Archaeology and archives later gave voice to those who had no courtroom and no chronicler. The legacy is tangible in the cistern, the adjusted laws, and in the small cooperative that continued for decades. If this story shifted your view of the past, tell us which parts surprised you most and why. And do not forget to subscribe so we can keep bringing these unvarnished accounts of the past to light. The past is not a museum display. It is a ledger of lives, and every life taken for granted deserves to be remembered.
Truth. So subscribe and join our community of curious minds. And remember, the simplest fact that keeps me up at night: survival is not a story of heroes, but a fragile arithmetic of choices and resources, and that truth matters more than any legend.